All right, so let's start our class today. So today we will finish the institutional analysis, and there are some remaining parts from that spatial modeling that we did last week, and also we're going to move on to democracies and legislatures as well. And then, so last week, let me just refresh your memory a little bit. So we were talking about how we used veto player theory and as a kind of spatial modeling for analyzing policymaking process, especially when we focus on institutional differences. And then we applied that spatial modeling to a special case of trade negotiation between two countries. And as I said, I mean, this is a wonderful example. It's not that difficult, and also very easy to incorporate features of different institutions as well. And of course, we offered a very simplified version of, making contrast between democracies and dictatorships or autocracies. And then, of course, another important feature of this is that it's not just about how we present all these institutional features in analysis, but also the rule of the game. And so here we adopt a very specific kind of rule, which we call the TD game. So take it or leave it. And so, of course, using this will highly simplify the setting as well. So now the home country will be the first mover. The foreign country can only accept or reject the offer. So in other words, there isn't really a bargaining there, right? So sometimes bargaining, as I said, is something like you can ask a little more or a little less, but this is not. So using this, we went through the analysis last week already. And so you probably, so of course, for today, we're going to actually bring in a twist to the model. And I think I mentioned that last week. If you don't have too many questions regarding this analysis, but let me remind you, there are actually some assumptions we have to make in order to finish analysis. And those assumptions sometimes are not necessarily very realistic in actual politics. So I'm going to talk about that, and especially using Taiwanese politics as an example. And so of course, I'm not going to go all the way through all these again. But maybe I can stop here for a while to just ask if you have any questions regarding the analysis that we did last week. No? Okay, so suppose you don't have the question now. So that's bringing the twist, as I said. So of course, last week is just about having two countries, and then they are of different institutional settings, right? Some are democracies, some are autocracies, and they come of different policy preferences as well. Some are liberal autocracies, some are protectionist autocracies, right? And then this is the conclusion, right? And also, the original paper this analysis is based is actually trying to argue institutions matter. If you have a democracy dyad versus democracy autocracy dyad, these different pairs are going to have different levels of trade barriers. And as this graph tries to show, indeed, eventually, in conclusion, we have different levels of protection across these different dyads. But the thing is, what is interesting, I guess, especially in this context, is, of course, I'm not teaching trade negotiation in this class, but we're trying to say, well, we can use sometimes simple mathematics to present all these political features in a model and then help us understand interesting implications. So let me bring in the twist. So, right, so we can actually use, this trade negotiation as a context again, and then, I think I mentioned this example for quite a few times in class, right? So back to 2014, there was this massive student movement, and later we call that sunflower student movements, and quite a few of them actually. The very prominent figures in that movement now are also politicians, and there were students here actually, but we're not here. We're back in the old campus, and so a little bit of the context. if you still remember, if you forgot or you didn't know. So the trigger was the government back then, they signed a service trade pact with China in Chongqing, and then they brought the deal back to Taiwan to allow our Congress to ratify that treaty. But the thing is, obviously, back then there were, of course, the opposition party back then was DPP, and they were not obviously happy about that. And there are also other social groups. They don't like that, and because they think this is going to increase the influence of China over Taiwan, and it's not just economically but also politically, and therefore it triggered a lot of reactions, and especially contentious reactions from the civil society here in Taiwan. And of course, another very important background is that ever since former President Ma came to power in 2008, he started actually initiating a lot of new trade and economic cooperation opportunities with China. And I guess there's no denying, even across the different camps of scholars or politicians. Well, I mean, there's no denying that this kind of new opportunities for economic cooperation did create new wealth. But the problem is not about the wealth that was created. The problem is about how it was distributed. And so, as you probably going to know, if you want to take other classes in international political economy or international economics, trade in general is welfare enhancing, but it also has distribution effects. So in other words, there are losers, there are winners. So the losers back then, they of course were trying to stop the trade pact, the service trade pact, by mobilizing socially and politically. And so that was another important background back then. There was this distributional conflict, the fight between the winners and losers, and also the worsening income inequality here in Taiwan. And also something, given your age, but we didn't realize that, was the housing prices. I think in Taiwan, I wasn't here actually. So housing in Taiwan, was not that high. For example, back in early 2000, but because of this, money flow, either from mainland China to Taiwan or from other places, a lot of money actually went into the housing market and drove up the prices. And that's especially here in Taipei. Maybe that's not the case in other counties, but here in Taipei, I mean, you can see, basically, it's hard for people to afford buying a house, given the salary, unless you have some support from your families. All right, so but that's the background. And then the political implications of that is, that's why I call it, this is a very dramatic 2014, because that kind of set a stage for DPP to be in power for now. It's like going to be almost 12 years, right? So right after the Sunflower Student Movement, and this is a 10th anniversary for that, right? So that's right. So I think there will be some events, in memory of this event. As you can probably see it on the internet. But that happened in March, right? And then towards the end of that year, 2014, there was a local election, and KMT obviously because of that, lost almost all the elections big time in all different counties. And then also at a central level, that also means the dissolution of pro-business or trade coalition in Taiwan, because, well, that's pretty much what, especially given your age, since 2014, the cross relationship was, of course, never went back again. It's not like either economically or politically. But I'm not saying it's bad or good, but the thing is, it's just a fact, right? So previously there was this coalition of like we should do more business and trade with China, and then for some people this is a way to create peace across the Taiwan Strait. But that's controversial. But I guess another even stronger voice was the worry that given this connecting, growing connections, economic connections between, across the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and China, well, actually just giving China more leverage and influence here in Taiwan. So, people were worried about that, and therefore, ever since 2014, basically, we haven't seen any dramatic or substantial growth in trade across the Taiwan Strait. And then, of course, for the administration, the Ma Ying-jeou administration back then, of course, it was obviously losing political capital. And therefore, as I said, I mean, since 2016 now, KMT, sorry, DPP won the election again. So DPP is going to be a governing party for 12 years, even though losing the majority in the Congress. And then, yeah, installed cross relationship and also regional integration as well. But the thing is, this is just a background, not the main points. I just want to let you know. This is we want to contextualize that model in this setting. So thinking about okay, so and then of course some pictures that I think I showed you before. So there's no need to show them too much again. So the thing is, so thinking about this, so this is the the graph we use all the time, right? Throughout different scenarios. And so how about like plotting Taipei and Beijing on this map? So now we're thinking about the home country, of course, is Taipei. And also because Taiwan's a democracy, so we also have two players here. Right? One is the president, right? And the other one is Congress. Okay, and then we retain the assumption that Taiwanese Congress back then was more protectionist. So in other words, people inside the Congress were more cautious about this growing influence of China's and also the furthering the economic integration between the two sides. And the president obviously, well, this is actually pretty realistic, right? The president back then was very eager to promote because that's actually, in 2009, there was this ACFA, right? So you probably know that. It was another economic cooperation framework signed by both China and Taiwan. And then the Service Trade Pact actually was just a continuance of that. So it was a second step. It wasn't something surprising, but it was not until then that I think the people here were able to mobilize so much support for something against that. But anyway, so in other words, retaining the assumption is actually quite realistic because the president back then was very eager to sign and more liberal in this sense, and Congress was a little bit more against it. And for Beijing, I mean, of course, I mean, we don't have to actually say too much about its preference. I mean, basically, Beijing's preference is very obvious, right? Beijing's political agenda is to start from economic integration and then gradually move, into the political, arena. But for now, at least, back in 2014, it was still, there are still people, on both sides, they're still playing this economic game, right? So let me just go through this again. So according to our analysis last week, right, so now Taipei is here, originally it was a home country, right? And then foreign country is Beijing. And then, okay, so you probably know that already, right? So the preferences for the Congress is TC, and for Beijing is T star, A star. And then at the beginning of the analysis, we have to draw a concentric indifference curves, until we determine the win set, right? So this is the first step. And the second step is to find the contract curve, which is the line connecting TP and T star A star, because these are two people or two parties that are actually negotiating with each other, right? So now we have, the contract curve, and then we maintain the assumption that Taipei is the first mover. So it's very easy, right? So what's the solution? What's the equilibrium of this game? 0.2, right? Right, so it's 0.2, right? Because the president is going to choose the point that is closest to his own ideal point. And at the same time, this point is located right inside the win set. So in other words, this point is acceptable to both Taipei and Beijing, the Congress, I mean. All right, so, but, okay, so far, so good. I mean, it's just basically a repetition of what we did last week. Nothing special, nothing surprising. But the problem is, this is not something that has happened, right? This doesn't predict the results, right? If and we follow the analysis, there shouldn't be sunflowers to the movement at all, right? And I suppose maybe, Cohen wouldn't be the mayor, and we have an entirely different world. Now, imagine that. But so what's the problem here? What's the problem with this analysis? when we apply that, when we apply the spatial modeling we did last week directly to this case, and we found this is contradictory to what actually happened. So can you think of any issues and any assumptions that might not be necessarily appropriate, and we should change that? We should lift that assumption. Maybe or change the assumptions. Anyone?
So perhaps the situation back then, you have to consider like people's sentiment.
Mhm.
So it won't be just like economic population based on the preference of both sides.
Okay, well, this is a good point. But if you want to contextualize that point in this, what would you do?
How to add a people factor?
Okay. All right, so this is a good suggestion in the sense that, okay, so this is something I would like to say, indeed, this is a great point, because this model is very elite-centric. What does that mean? We only include people inside the system. In other words, the president, right, he has the power, obviously. Congress, of course, they also have lots of power. So these are political elites, right? And needless to say, Beijing, but of course, Beijing's point, I mean, it's a dictatorship, so we don't have to take too much account of that anyway. But in democracies like Taiwan's, we exclude social activists totally in this analysis. So there is no role for them to play. And we assume Congress can fully represent the will of the people, which is obviously not necessarily true. So one fix to this is we should have another player. But that's a little bit unusual, of course, because we are doing institutional analysis, right? So you see that interesting tension here. I mean, I think I mentioned that, for example, within social sciences, economists, political scientists, and sociologists, we always disagree with each other. And this is one of the points, I think. So sometimes I think political scientists, we focus too much on institutions, and we talk about people inside institutions, but there are people who are outside institutions, and they don't have power. They don't have political power. They don't have institutional power. But that doesn't mean they won't be able to play a role in determining the policies. And of course, in a usual democracy, what we do is that we have periodic elections, right? In Taiwan, every 4 years, people have the chance to express their voices. But that's actually also pretty indirect. That's why last semester, we actually spent a week on social movements, right? Well, that's because sometimes, even though whether it's legal or illegal, people outside the system can also express their voices through these means. And of course, the extreme version of it would be like revolution, totally dismantle the government or totally overthrow the government. But that's extreme. But but the sunflower student movement is a great case where you see people actually took the streets and then they even occupied the chamber of the Congress and then doing something. So that's a good point. But what else? This might not be the only issue of this analysis, but it's a great point. Others? Anyone? I think I mentioned that a little bit last week. But other points? Well, as I said, when the president decided to pick number 2 in here, basically the assumption is the president is very aware of the preferences of the Congress, right? So that's why he can draw this circle, right? So otherwise, well, suppose both of them are negotiating. I mean, they just negotiating on their own and without taking into account the preferences of others. That's also likely. And in that case, of course, it's harder for that equilibrium to arise. But the thing is, if you don't have the information of the win set, it's hard for you to pick the right point. Maybe, the president, might actually pick, for example, without the information that we said, the president might actually pick something here. It's even closer to his ideal point, but completely outside the win set. So in other words, this analysis also makes the assumption that everyone has almost like a perfect information about other people's preferences. So what actually happened could be the president wasn't aware of people's preferences inside the Congress or have misperceptions. And this is actually another important area. I forget if I say anything about that last semester, but misperceptions, as a topic is very interesting, right? Because people, I mean, it's not enough to say people have misperceptions, but we want to understand the sources of misperceptions and what kind of misperceptions people might have, right? So in this case, the president might not be that well versed in analyzing the preferences from the Congress. So, but this is actually quite true, right? Going back to the sunflower student movement in 2014, if you remember what happened, or if you were told what happened, so the students stormed the chamber of the Congress and occupied it for about a month. And then back to the government itself, of course, who was the speaker back then? Wang Jinping, right? So he was also a KMT person. So in other words, the KMT enjoyed both the majority in the Congress and also the president, right? So supposedly they belong to the one party. Supposedly they can communicate. And then, it's, I guess, as I said, it's for sure that president wanted the deal. And then the speakers allowed the students to occupy the chamber for months. So what happened? Of course, we have lots of people's memories and anecdotes about what happened. But what is clear is that, well, obviously, President Ma back then and Speaker Wang, they obviously didn't see eye to eye on many things, and they might have political feud because they both competed. They both competed for the chairman of the KMT for a while ago. So that kind of political feud might be the reason that the Speaker Wang Wen actually didn't want to cooperate. So the whole point here, of course, is not about that political episode, the anecdotes, but it's about the analysis. So doing this analysis this way risks making a huge assumption about president's knowledge about Congress's preferences, which sometimes might not be the case. So in actual modeling, we do have to take all these case-specific details into account and then change the model. So that's one. So other things, other thoughts on this? Okay, so that's fine. So well, I mean, if you are interested, of course, we can think more about this and then see what kind of analysis you can do. But the point here is, again, now we're going to wrap up the topic about institutional analysis. So first of all, the reason for doing this is that we believe, especially inside political science, that I think in other social sciences as well, that institutions do matter. But what we mean by institutions are formal institutions. And as I also told you before, in sociology, for example, they have a broader view of institutions. So not just formal institutions, right? They don't just talk about like governments, but they also like talking about I think that's the example we mentioned also, patriarchy, right? So it's like a male, female, like gender tensions, right? So I mean, there are all kinds of social institutions, and these institutions also exercise power on people. But that's obviously, I mean, but we as political scientists, we focus more on formal institutions. And therefore, the topic here, well, basically is about how we can show their differences, and especially how they impact the policy making. And then comes to the second point, the veto player theory. And veto player theory is one of the very popular paradigms in the political science where we actually use that to analyze the differences. And as you can see, either from last week, the presentation, I told you that, well, we can actually analyze the stability of policies according to the number of veto players in different institutions. And then in a broader context, we can also apply that kind of modeling, especially what we call the spatial modeling, the country-to-country negotiations or interactions, and of course, people person to person too. And as we have shown you already, indeed, there are some differences if you negotiate with a different system. If you negotiate with a different kind of political institutions. And right. So, and then, but of course, one thing I would also like to caution you about is when we actually apply this kind of analysis to actual cases, you do have to think about whether some of the assumptions are reasonable or not. And but it doesn't mean this kind of analysis is useless. It's still quite useful. It's still quite useful. The problem is just you have to adjust your modeling assumptions to the realities. All right. So any questions regarding this whole topic or this? Anything? No? Good. All right. So with that, we are moving on to the next topic, legislature. So we're going to spend like 3 weeks on this. So because inside democracies, we have all kinds of different institutions. And in modern world, we have mostly 3 different powers: legislatures, judicial branches, and also judicial branch and executive. So we'll probably spend some time on this. And while we go through, of course, I mean, we won't be able to spend too much time on the details because different countries, even though we do have some typology like parliamentary versus presidential, but actually each country has its own institutional details. So we'll touch upon on some of the details just to allow you to kind of have a sense of how system works in these different countries, but they're pretty stylized. So, but I also want to emphasize the importance of their functionalities and how they interact with executives. Okay, so then let's move on. But before that, one thing when we talk about legislatures, there are some interesting historical origins because, of course, if you take a look at any political science books, I mean, mostly, it's in the Western context, and of course now we study dictatorships a lot. But the thing is, legislatures are actually mostly the features of the Western institutions, and most of the even Asian countries or other parts of non-Western countries also adopt this kind of institutional design. But to think about the origin, and especially when you contrast this with China, right? Or other dictatorships. I mean, in China, we have something like Congress, but it's not, in China, that kind of Congress is very different, and it's not an invention of Chinese, right? So in other words, there must be something special and specific to European history that we have this kind of institutional design nowadays. So if you take a look at a textbook, for example, it traces the historical origin of modern legislatures to European feudalism, and which is something, of course, China didn't have. And let me read this. Interesting. And the reason is the origin of parliaments. The interesting thing is, if you want to have legislatures that basically make an assumption about the particular kind of a state-society relationship, right? And legislatures, essentially, its definition is a collection of people who represent the interests from the society. And so when you have legislatures, and especially when you have executive power accountable to legislatures, that implies certain kind of power relationship. But why did that kind of power relationship arise, and how did it arise? And as I said in the textbook, I mean, it does a great job in terms of telling us this is actually, its origin, goes back to the European feudalism. And um, let me read one of the quotation here. It's actually quite interesting because countries like those countries with absolutist traditions without feudalism, they don't have this separation of powers to begin with. So that's why when it comes to the definition of feudalism, here is the definition provided by the textbook. So feudalism is a system of political power dispersed among layers. So different layers of power, and therefore, the people on top, they're not necessarily the most powerful people because there are other power centers at different layers. And so, in a European context, so the example given by the textbook was this interesting pledge in Spain. So there's this medieval Aragon is a city in northeast Spain. And then, let me read this quotation. So when these noblemen, the oath of these nobles of medieval Aragon in Spain, when they pledged the oath to the new king, this is what they said. Here, quote, "We who are as good as you swear to you, who are no better than we, to accept you as our king and sovereign lord, provided you observe all our statutes and laws, and if not, no." Right? So this is a very good. That's why I mean the textbook uses this sentence. It's very representative of this kind of power relationship, right? So, or if you remember, something we're going to be talking about again this semester is a commitment problem. So essentially, in the Western or European feudal context, the king or the leader of the country actually is not someone who is far superior than other people, than other nobles, or than other aristocrats. So the country, well, essentially the power structure is a cooperation between the king, or sometimes today we call dictatorship or dictators, and the people in a society. They're not in the government, but they're in the society, but they're still powerful. And according to this interesting oath, at the beginning, these nobles, they tell the king, "You are no better than us. So we allow you to be the king and the sovereign lord, provided," right? This is a condition. It's simply because when you observe all our statutes and laws, and if you violate those statutes and laws, and then you're not going to be our king anymore. So it seems to imply a certain kind of equality between the king and all those other powerful nobles. So this is the historical origin of the legislature, because inside the legislatures, these are all people who are actually also very powerful, and they have resources to support the regime. And without the support, maybe the king won't, or the dictator won't be the dictator and the king anymore. So that's why the textbook traces the origin to European feudalism. And another more important point that we actually mentioned last semester, and the textbook mentioned it again here, is this very famous statement: "War makes states." What does that mean? And we when we talked about modern states last semester, we mentioned that the reason why we have a states, because modern states is a very particular political form of organization, right? So compared to empires, to all kinds of different political organizations that we used to have in human history, modern state is very different in terms of the efficiency of mobilizing resources, and also the capacity for monitoring people. And I think one thing I mentioned last semester was, well, we all have to pay taxes, right? So why? Is there a reason for that? Right, so this is obviously a power relationship. Why working hard, they're teaching me, right? And then get my money, and now I have to pay taxes every year. But why? It's your obligation, but in what? But the thing is, but in a Western context, it's sometimes framed as this is the way you you contribute to the maintenance of the state because you sign a contract, right? That goes back to the social contract theory we also mentioned last semester. The formation of the state is based on people's volitions and people's willingness. You sign up for this, right? So because we want to get out of the state of nature, so we sign a social contract to create a state, a government. And then and that's why you have to pay to participate. So it seems that it makes sense in a way that I enjoy the benefits provided by the state and therefore I have to pay taxes. And in more specifically in this context, it means that I pay taxes and therefore I deserve representation in the legislature, right? So this is, I think, the key phrase you all know about, from American Revolution, and we'll mention that again, of course. But the thing is, going back to this war makes states argument. So back to the European, medieval times, if the king or the queens, if they want to fight wars, and as I said, from the very beginning, all these leaders, they are leaders because other people want them to be the leaders, right? They are serving other people. So they themselves might not have enough resources to fight wars. And therefore, in European history, it's very common that when they want to fight wars against other countries, they will have to come back to the legislature, to the parliament, to raise funds, to ask all these nobles and aristocrats to donate money for him or her to fight a war. And therefore, you have this. So, in other words, again, this is just a symbol of delegation relationship between them. And so, when it comes to this war, when we say war makes states, this means that the states as a political organization was formed because they all want to fight wars. In this process, they have to create something like a legislature so they can ask for money from these people. And these people, these aristocrats who have resources, are willing to pay because they have the right to join the legislature. They have seats in the legislature. And therefore, this very famous slogan from American Revolution in the 18th century, no taxation without representation, expresses very well. So the concept in the Western context, that legislatures, inside the legislatures, they have, you have representation, and that's why they're willing to pay taxes, right? As a way to, of course, as a way to participate in how the state is run. So it's not simply run, it's not a one-man show by the dictator. It's actually kind of like a country collectively run by all these people, the governments and also the people who are in the legislatures. So these are the historical origins of the legislatures. Essentially, legislatures, inside legislatures, you have all kinds of interests from the society, right? And then they represent those social interests, and then either to monitor what government is doing or to contribute to how the policy should be designed. And so this is essentially what we do in the modern legislatures. And but at this moment, we also have to make the distinction between presidential and parliamentary system. And of course, I think you're also well aware of all these. But let me just quickly go over that. So, well, this is a pretty nice way to make the distinction, right? So, in the parliamentary system, well, let's begin from parliamentary. So, in the parliamentary system, there's only one source of legitimacy, which is, the voters, they elect parliament. And then inside the parliament, the different parties, they can form coalition. Or if they can, if you have a majority party, then you don't have to do that. And then, inside the parliament, they will elect, so the parliamentarians or the congressmen, congresswomen, they will elect and prime minister, and then prime minister will organize a cabinet, and then, of course, guides ministries. So, in other words, in the parliamentary system, it's you only have one election here. Everything starts from this. But in a presidential system, the case is different. You have a bunch of voters here, but they got to choose for 2 times. They elect a parliament. They also elect a president, and the president chooses cabinet and also ministers or departments. So the point here is this is something we're going to come back again, the difference between the separation of powers and the fusion of powers. So in the parliamentary system, you have fusion of powers, right? Because the parliaments, at the same time, it is where you form your governments. But here it's different. In the presidential system, voters actually, they give legitimacy to two separate institutions. One thing, before we take the break, one thing I'd like to maybe ask you in the next hour is that, of course, you have fusion of power here in the parliamentary system, and also separation of powers in the presidential system. But the thing is, have you ever thought about this? The question, and why? Why you have these differences, and what are the also historical origins of this separation or the difference between the two systems? So that's I don't know if you ever learned about this before, but they're actually interesting, I think, philosophical question to answer. Okay, so let's move on. So 2 minutes before the break. So the thing about this fusion or separation, as I said, it's about the executive legislative relationship, right? And well, we have a few examples, or several examples in the world that they adopt the system of separation of powers, and the most prominent one, of course, the United States. And the U.S. constitutional design, well, I'm not talking about details, but basically the separation of powers is based on Montesquieu's speech, the spirit of laws. But do you remember why? What's inside Montesquieu's spirit, the spirit of the laws? We all know that this is the foundation of that, but why? It has an interesting, I think, later you might take classes in political philosophy or history of political ideas. I think based on, maybe from today's perspective, not necessarily very intellectually stimulating, but it's because in ancient Greece, if you read ancient Greek philosophy, and especially Plato, Aristotle, you will come across very often, when they talk about political regimes, they talk about the different types, and it based on the number of people who have power. So if you have rule by one, this is kingship, all right? But another thing, if you have rule by a few, this will be no, aristocracy. But that's the corrupt form, actually, the aristocracy. And then if you have, this is the thing. So if you have rule by many, that's democracy, right? You probably know that, right? The democracy, demo means people, right? Acrocy basically is a suffix for governance. Okay, so in ancient Greece, the people have these ideas that in the world, I mean, we have, this is like the ancient Greece comparative politics, all right? So there's three different types of regimes. But the thing is, I think they also, those ancient Greek philosophers, they also have this cyclical version of history. They think history is to just repeat itself. So it's just like in a cycle. And therefore, sometimes you start from a monarchy or a kingship, but what if you got a very bad king? What kind of regime is going to be? There's another word, tyranny, right? You could have a tyrant and then that become a tyranny. It's still ruled by one, but it's a very lousy regime. So in other words, the corrupt form of kingship or monarchy is tyranny. And then aristocracy, and that's what you said, oligarchy. So aristocracy, once you have very bad people to be in power, then that aristocracy would become oligarchy. And then democracy, well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, most of the Greek philosophers don't have good views on. They don't like democracies, actually. But anyway, so democracies, if it's very bad, you become a mob rule, so rule by a mob. Okay, so in ancient Greece, they have this interesting view about like the world or the countries. They will go through all the cycles. So from the very beginning, you have monarchy or kingship, and then become corrupt. When it is corrupt, it becomes tyranny, and then maybe some people got, maybe you have other aristocrats, come along and then occupy the country and then change the country. They become aristocracy. and then it will also decay into oligarchy, and then decay, not decay, but maybe saved by lots of people and become democracy, and then democracy can decay into mob rule, and then everything goes through the cycle. And so the problem here is then how do we stop the cycle? You can think about the question like, and then I'll give you the answer in the next hour. So let's take a break for 20 minutes. All right, so let's come back for our second hour. All right, so I was talking about the Greek philosophers' view on political regimes. And as I said, they identify 6 different types. It's like a cycle, right? From monarchy or kingship to tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and mob rule. And it's like a cycle. So, and then, I think it was a little bit later than Aristotle and Plato that there was another guy coming along. I think it's called Polybius, and a Latin philosopher. And he said, well, how about mixing all these different regimes into a mixed type? A mixed regime is going to be very stable because it has all the nice features from all the 3 different types of regimes. So you can have a leader, the king, or the queen, and then you can also have the very smart, intelligent aristocrats, and also you have the representation of ordinary people. If you mix all these different regimes to become a mixed type, then maybe you can stop the cycle. So, of course, I mean, we don't have time for the details of that kind of philosophy, but the thing is, the view actually influences, I think this kind of mixed regime as an idea influenced Montesquieu and also the US founding fathers. That's why in the American Constitution, you're thinking about that. The president is the king, right? And then who are the aristocrats? Senate. They represent, because Senate is a word, that means, people who are not just old, but also pretty smart. So you have the Senate representing the smart people, or the aristocrats, the noblemen. And then you have Congress too. And Congress, American Congress, represents ordinary people. So in other words, this idea of the separation of powers has a Greek origin. It came from the idea that if we want to stop the cycle and create a very stable regime, we actually have to mix the features of all the 3 different types. You have the rule by 1, which is the president to represent the executive power. You need to have aristocrats, which is the Senate, and then you also need to have democracy, which is in American Constitution is the Congress. So that's why in the textbook as well, I mean, it explains well that the US Constitutions adopt this idea and they have the separation of powers. But the thing is, it doesn't just have the 3 components, right? It also has another feature, which is checks and balances. This means that we give each institution some powers, but at the same time, the powers have to be used to check the power of the other institution. So there isn't a single institution that can actually abuse the power it has. So, well, we would talk about the details a bit later, but for example, in the US Constitution or American constitutions, the president, of course, has some power, but at the same time, it has a veto power, right? So once the Congress passes some bill the president doesn't like, the president can veto this. And then, but if Congress has 2/3 of majority, he can also veto again the president. So, and also a lot of the appointments have to go through the Congress. This also, of course, impose some constraints on the presidential powers, right? You cannot appoint anyone you like. So again, we'll get to the details later. But the thing is, in the presidential system, the separation of powers, they don't just have these different, institutions as the holders of different powers. They also impose checks and balances among themselves. And the final thing is, this is very different from, oh, well, what happened? Oh, no, what should I read? Oh. What can happen in a presidential system is divided government? Well, because, well, this is almost by design, right? Because back to this, I think back to this graph, the voters, they get two, elections. So they can elect the parliament and also elect the president. So there's a chance, of course, there won't be a consistency in parties between the two. So that's why you have divided governments. So this is like a little bit like what we have now here in Taiwan, right? So the president-elect, William Lai, is a DPP person, while the majority in the Congress is actually the KMT, even though it's a very weak majority. But so that's what sometimes we call the divided governments. You have two branches, occupied by two different majorities. Well, but by contrast, in a parliamentary system, the executive legislative relationship is represented by the fusion of powers, and therefore, under the system, executive is just the offshoot of the legislature, and we just showed you that, right? But the thing is, of course, once you look at that system, you can imagine that, well, in that system, the government can almost pass every bill it wants, right? Because it owns the majority. And that's a very reason for that party to be the party in power. But the thing is, the legislature is not that weak, because in those systems, they usually have the vote of no confidence or confidence. So in other words, in many cases, actually, sometimes the legislature, they can pass the vote of no confidence or confidence then to oust the current administration, and they have a new election coming up. And also what can happen in the parliamentary systems that you have sometimes minority governments, depending on whether they can successfully form a coalition. Well, that's very likely, right? For example, in the current Taiwanese legislature, well, KMT has the most seats, but it's not a super majority, right? It's a majority, but it's not more than 50% of the seats. And therefore, well, in a parliamentary setting, you can imagine that. So in that case, how can you form governments, right? Because there isn't a single party in the Congress or parliaments that has the majority. And so in that case, they either have to form a coalition. So in other words, they get, like in German case, that's what happens quite often, that you actually have to have a coalition among two parties or between two parties, and then you could form a coalition government. Or there's also a chance that it becomes a minority government because it doesn't have the majority. You have a weak majority, maybe the biggest party in a parliament, but they don't have a super majority. So this can also happen under the parliamentary system. So another important dimension here is not just about it's not just about the executive legislative relationship. Another important thing here is how we analyze the relationship between two different chambers or legislatures, because as we already told you, some countries, they have two chambers, some have one, right? So that's what we call the unicameralism versus bicameralism. And in comparative politics, we have essentially have two dimensions. One is congruence. What does that mean? So congruence, bicameralism, occurs when the two legislative chambers have a similar political composition. And incongruence, bicameralism, occurs when the two legislative chambers differ in their political composition. So in American context, what is that? Is that congruent or incongruent? Incongruent, right? Because Senate basically represents the interest of different states, right? That's why each state has two representatives. But for the Congress, it represents essentially all the people. So in other words, the political composition of these two, chambers is different in American context and also in British context, right? So House of Lords versus the House of Commons, the composition is very different. But the thing is, something they call the male apportionment. This is important because, well, I will give you some examples, but it's pretty rare to have congruent bicameralism actually. So what's the point of doing that, right? You might imagine yourself. What's the point of doing that? One, you have two chambers, but they represent the same kind of people. What's the meaning of doing that? It's a waste of resources. But of course, there are cases. So most of the countries, I think, if they have two chambers, most of them are incongruent, bicameralism. And the reason is, you might also guess what kind of country might have this kind of institutional design. A lot of them are federal states, right? Because in the federalism, essentially the country is composed of these different partners. All right. So in the US, there's states, right? And German is Bundes, and cantons in Switzerland. So it's because the country, and Canada too. Canada call that provinces, right? So because you have all these subunits, and so these subunits they come together to organize this country, and therefore they have to have their representation at a state level. The central level. So in many cases, in those countries, they use one of the chambers to represent the interests of these subunits. So that's what I just said, was Senate, or in German case, Bundesrat. So these are institutions that try to accommodate the interests of these local units. But at the same time, you also have lower chambers like House of Commons or the American Congress. They represent the interests of people. But the thing is, in many of these federal states, well, that's because I need to tell you another thing, which is when we talk about federal states, mostly it's the concept about the federalism is the geographical differences, right? The country is further divided into different parts. But especially in the European context, some of these federal concepts are non-geographical. It could be linguistic. What does that mean? Well, that's because, well, of course, in the case of Switzerland, it's easy because they overlap, right? So the Francophone, German-speaking and English-speaking. So that you have different. Wait, sorry, there's no English-speaking, Italian-speaking. So basically, you have three parts, and they concentrate in these three different parts of the country, and therefore, the linguistic differences overlap with geographical differences. But in some countries, that's not necessarily the case, especially you have minorities. And people might not necessarily live in the same place, but if you have minorities who speak different languages, and the federal states, they can actually give special rights to these people when it comes to the linguistic policies. For example, they can teach their kids their languages first, right before they have to attend the schools to learn the national language. So there are all kinds of this kind of special arrangements for the minorities. And so this is actually there's a very famous book, and we don't read it nowadays that much, which is called The Consensual Democracy. It's written by a very famous political scientist, Aaron Leipart, who is a Dutch. And so in his book, he uses a lot of European countries' examples, saying, well, in these countries, because they want to reach consensus among all these different social groups, so in their constitutional design, they actually allow these people to have overrepresentation. And what happens sometimes is that the upper chamber is used as a way to allow these people to be represented, because these people are minorities. So it's hard, especially if they are not necessarily concentrated geographically. So sometimes it's hard for them to have representation in the Congress at all, right? Because there's just too few people. So in these countries that pursue consensus inside the country, they will allow these people to be represented in an upper chamber. So that's why this incongruent design actually has a very nice feature of allow the country to search for consensus and also to consolidate the country. So no one is, well, I mean, this is exaggeration, but not many people were excluded from the system. That's how this consensual democracy can be built. Okay, so this is the important point about how sometimes countries use the bicameralism to accommodate minorities in their societies. So this is something worth explaining as well. And then the second dimension is either they are symmetric or asymmetric, but this is probably easier to understand. Symmetric bicameralism occurs when the two legislative chambers have equal or near equal constitutional power. Asymmetric bicameralism occurs when the two legislative chambers have unequal constitutional powers. All right. And then, of course, in many cases, upper chambers are much more likely to have co-equal power with the lower house when citizens play a direct role in electing upper chamber representatives. But this is rare, right? But in the US, it's the case. The upper chamber, we call the Senate, the upper chamber. The Senate, of course, the senators, they are also directly elected by American people. But that's not the case, for example, in a British context, right? In a British case, the House of Lords, we'll talk about some details again, but they are not elected by people. So, well, this is a very typical case of asymmetric bicameralism in the UK, because the House of Lords essentially is pretty, well, I mean, maybe it's too far-fetched to say it's a rubber stamp, but it doesn't have too much power to stop any bills that House of Commons wants. Okay, so you have these two different dimensions, and they allow us to draw a graph like this. So, okay, so according to these two dimensions, we could have 4 different cells here, and then representing of three different models. The strong bicameralism, as you can see here, Australia, Germany, Switzerland, United States, and it's not surprising, right? So I just explained some of the details. Well, Germany, Switzerland, and United States, these are all federal states, and therefore the two chambers are incongruent in their political composition, but their powers are pretty symmetric. All right. There's some, for example, in the US context, there's some small differences, but actually they are pretty symmetric in terms of the legislative powers. And then you have this, going to the other the other direction of the diagonal, insignificant bicameralism. So these are congruent, but asymmetric. So Austria, Bahamas, Jamaica. I mean, I don't know if anyone studies Jamaica's political system. So anyway, so that, well, I mean, they have 2 chambers, but they are congruent. In other words, the composition is very similar, but they're also asymmetric. So I guess you might want to ask, what's the meaning of having 2 chambers? I mean, I don't know Australia. I've been there for quite a while actually, but I don't know. But the thing is, okay, so you have this kind of insignificant bicameralism. But another more interesting model is weak bicameralism. So especially this lower right. So you have incongruent, so like UK, right? House of Commons versus House of Lords, and India, Canada, France too. So incongruent composition, but they are asymmetric. And therefore, it's pretty weak. So you have 2 chambers, but actually, the thing is, you might wonder why can't you just get rid of one of the chambers? But of course, in a British context, it's almost like, why don't we get rid of the whole royal family? That's not this difficult. So, but the thing is, and you can also imagine that, well, a lot of them, even bicameral, and it's a legacy from the. It's probably the legacy from the maybe historical past, if they used to be not a republic, so they're used to be ruled under a monarchy. So that's likely, or an aristocracy. So they need to have a chamber for these people. So and then I think one of the very popular model is the upper left, Japan and Italy. I don't even know Japan has two chambers actually. I know the diet, right? So the weak bicameralism, the problem here is the composition is similar, the congruent, but they are also very symmetric. So, well, so in Japan, you also have two chambers, but the thing is just if they are similar, what's the meaning of having these two, right? But Japan is a monarchy, so it's a what constitutional monarchy, I mean, to be more precise. So it's kind of weird why Japan needs to have two, but that's just the fact. But anyway, so our point is to know in a world of congresses or legislatures, we have two. We can use these two dimensions to divide them into these four different cells, and then understand the operations inside them. But I guess what is more interesting is that's have a little discussion of the real institutional details in these different countries. I chose UK, Germany, France, and US to be examples. So let's go through their institutional details. This is the British Parliament, the Palace of Westminster. And then I think I showed you this before also, the House of Commons. House of Commons, they have a pretty energetic debates. And I think still, until today, I enjoy watching the clips of their debates. It's pretty good, actually. So a little bit of the details, let's go through. Well, so the number of members of parliaments inside them, there are 650. I don't know if there's that many. So 650. And so compared to Taiwanese Congress, how many do we have here? 113. So it's pretty, I mean, UK is not that big, right? So, but they have 600 people, MPs. And then the terms of office, when I was a student, I mean, we didn't have this. So, but now in 2011, they passed this law, Fixed Term Parliament Act. That's what it's called. So since 2015, MP's tenure is codified to be at most 5 years. So now they have fixed. So previously, once you got elected, I mean, there's no rule saying you should serve for how long. So it's not until, even though previously, the parliament was normally or informally dissolved every 5 years. In UK, a lot of things are determined by, unwritten constitution. So, I mean, there isn't any rules for that. It's just based on people's conventions, right? So that's something they also pretty proud of. But the thing is, in the end, in 2011, they finally, made this happen. So they can at most serve for 5 years. And then there's some interesting details about the legislature in the UK. For example, the speaker, it's life tenure and non-partisan. So they have to be non-partisan for sure, but it's life tenure means that they can serve for their life unless they want to retire. But how does that work? How does that work? The thing is, someone, of course, that person, he or she, has to be from a particular district. It has to be from a particular party, right? But once this person decides, and of course, was chosen by the members of the parliament to be the speaker, this person can actually, no other parties would nominate anyone in his or her district. So it's always like, an easy win for this person. So, but at a price that this person has to be neutral and impartial. And so this is actually something, for example, in Taiwan, where in Taiwanese context, the current speaker, he is from the PR list. He's not from a particular district. Because Taiwan, you have two ballots. One is for the district, the other one is for the party list. So in the Taiwanese context, then we do it through this PR system and not through this. Because in UK, there's no PR. There's only one single district, and therefore they can only do this way. And inside the parliament, there are also two different, broadly speaking, there are two different kinds of MPs, depending on their seniorities. So there are frontbenchers. So as you can see here, in terms of where they sit. This is also, I guess, a sign of this is a center, right? And therefore, the farther you are, the less powerful you are. So all these are frontbenchers, right? So this is Cameron, right? And so when he was the prime minister. And so these are all ministers from the cabinet, and then these are shadow cabinet, the leader of the opposition in the week. And so these are frontbenchers. So they're party leaders, the prime minister, cabinet members, party leader, party whip. And these are the party with power for the opposition, not for the shadow cabinet members and their party whips. So the people, all these people that sit in the front. Nonetheless, if you are just not that powerful or just very young, just join the parliament, then you'll be backbenchers. You sit on the back, the rank and file MPs, and but still you got a chance to speak. So there are these people. I don't know who are these people actually. They even stand. They don't. So anyway, so I mean, if you're young or just not that powerful, you sit on the back. So this is a way they represent the power structure in the parliament in the UK. And so how it works? Well, after we finish introducing all these details, you might be able to make comparisons across different congresses and see how we can actually apply, for example, the veto player theory in here. So in terms of legislative process, in a British context, you have first reading. So in the first reading, you don't have any formal discussion. You just read the bill. And in the second reading, this is where the intensive debates happen. And also, in the UK, this is something that happens to modern legislatures, committees. So you don't just have like a plenary meeting for every MP, but actually you have people will go to different committees. So here they have standing committees or committee of the whole. And inside these committees, they can do revisions of individual clauses. And then once they finish all the three steps, then of course you can get into the third reading, which is the final step. But once the bill arrives at this stage of third reading, then most of the revisions can happen, but just most of the revisions will be just technical. You cannot have substantial revisions. Those have to happen before this. And then after you finish the reading, then of course, again, because this is bicameral in the UK, so the bill has to be submitted to the House of Lords to be passed. But the thing is, I think there are all kinds of interesting ways modern Congresses use to make themselves more efficient, right? Because democracy's democratic deliberation sometimes takes a long time. So there's closure, two kinds of closure here. The first one is this kangaroo closure. What is this? Kangaroo closure. Through this practice, only crucial clauses of a bill are taken up for debate and voting. And the other intervening clauses are then skipped over and taken as passed. So this is just, as I said, to increase the efficiency, to enhance the efficiency of the Congress then. Why is that kangaroo closure? Because kangaroo jumps, right? So you jump to those clauses that are crucial and then skip those are not. So it's a kangaroo closure used to help expedite the passing of the bill. And another thing is what they call the guillotine. Okay, so the guillotine, this is a way to limit the debate time. So the allocation of time, or this is actually from the UK Parliament website. So the allocation of time or guillotine motions have been used by governments to limit the amount of time that MPs can spend debating a particular stage of a bill in the House of Commons. So this doesn't happen in the House of Lords, because in the House of Lords, there are still limitations on how much time they can use to speak. So, you know what, the thing is, this is actually quite political, right? So, because you know, I mean, when we get to the American context, American case, sometimes you can use these skills like procrastinating to as a way to block a bill from passing, right? So it's a way to for especially for the minority party in the Congress to you know to block the bills they don't like, even though maybe eventually they will fail, but at least they show their stance to their constituents. So you know, on top of all these like very basic rules, we also have to know a little bit about their committees. So there are committees in the House of Commons. So there are two different, actually a couple of different types. One is standing committees. And so these are organized by the Committee on Selection. And inside the standing committees, they don't hold public hearings at all. They don't hold public hearings. And they basically deliberate over revisions from the second reading, okay? And then you also have the Committee of the Whole. And inside the Committee of the Whole, I mean, this is because as you can tell by the title, right? So this committee is attended by all the MPs. And then this is only for, you know, the bills that need broader consensus. And then they also have select committees. And inside the select committees, you have experts and they hold public hearings. But inside the state select committees, they have no decision-making power. It's only for consultation. So there's no, well, basically, only for consultative purposes, and there's no legislative deliberation. So obviously, select committees are only for, to be used as a way to collect opinions from experts. So this is committees in the House of Commons. And then let's get to the House of Lords. Well, this is much more luxurious, much more beautiful, actually. But the thing is, if you know the number of the House of Lords, you'll be surprised. The seats are probably not enough, right? Do you know how many? 700. Well, as of March 2024. So it varies. So now they have 786 members in the House of Lords in the UK. But if you know the composition, you would see that, well, this is a little bit like not for real. So, okay, so there are three different types of people who can be members of the House of Lords. First one were life peers. And also the second one, royal peers. And the third one, bishops. Well, this is just because, well, this is just a British tradition, right? So the bishops represent the religious interest, I suppose. Life peers, these are the people who can actually be knighted by the queen or king. Suppose you are very, you know, so excellent. You are Nobel Prize winners, for example, and the queen or now king can knight you. Actually, can make you a knight, right? Can actually make you. So you can give you titles. There are all kinds of different titles. So they can. So these people, the reason why they are called life peers is that they can only serve for their life, but they cannot pass their titles to their offsprings. This is different from the second one, the royal peers. Royal peers, they are just, you know, the aristocrats. I suppose the numbers are not that many. So the titles are hereditary. And so the numbers, so in other words, I guess the reason why they have this kind of 700 people there, most of them are public life peers. So they give special honors to these people who have excellent performance in all kinds of different areas. And so they can be members of the House of Lords, and then in addition to royal peers and bishops. So inside the House of Lords, there's no standing committee or no closure. And as I said, I mean, they can talk as long as they want. Because their decisions might not be very substantial anyway in terms of whether bills will be passed or not. But the thing is, this is rare, I suppose. But if that happens, when the House of Lords disagrees, if it's financial bills, they can only delay for no more than 30 days. So even if they don't like it, so this is the thing. Even if members of the House of Lords don't like the bills, they can only delay for 30 days. And beyond that, there's nothing they can do. But for non-financial bills, they can be delayed for no more than 1 year. So that's why I said, I mean, it's maybe not fair to say they're just rubber stamps because they still have some powers like this, but it's not substantial. And I guess they don't use it. Okay. And for the monarch, so this is again, so for the other parts of the British government, the monarch in the British system is just the head of the state. They are figurative, and most of their functions are, they have to be non-partisan. And they have to just basically ceremonial, they have to attend all kinds of ceremonies. And also they are the, very important attraction of tourism. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's pretty, all the palaces are pretty. Oh, by the way, so if you watch the Crown, right, so you should go. Just very nice palaces. The thing is, and also the government, the prime minister is appointed officially by the king or previously the queen. And the prime minister's powers include, first of all, inside the cabinet, the prime minister has the power to appoint or remove cabinet members. And also, well, the person will make the decision at a cabinet meeting. And so it's actually interesting that even though it's a parliamentary system, but inside the system, it'll be like presidential because the prime minister is pretty much like a president. So you know what? The thing is, historically, the prime minister is simply primus inter pares, so or first among equals. So that's historical. Historically, prime minister, of course, still is the kind of the representative of the country or the government. But the thing is, historically, the prime minister wasn't that powerful. It's not until recently. Now, the prime minister is almost like a president. So I think this happened, I think, a long time ago, almost like back to 1980s or 60s. And the reason is, the thing is, in the US, for example, the center of the gravitas, of course, is the president, right? The president is the most powerful person, politically speaking. And especially during the campaign, the candidates, they are the focus. But in the parliamentary system, supposedly, the prime minister is just one of the candidates or one of the members inside the parliament. But after the modern campaign techniques like televisions, radio, and nowadays the internet, rose, the prime minister in parliamentary system is almost like the president of United States. And the reason is, even in the UK, I mean, this has been the case for quite a while. So the prime minister now is the symbol of the party. And then once he or she got elected, then this person will be the symbol of the country, right? And therefore, the power of the prime minister, in a way, has been enhanced to a great extent compared to previously before the modern campaign techniques were invented. So that's the cabinet, and for the bureaucracy, the prime minister also has the power to appoint permanent secretaries. So this is like almost like in a Taiwanese context, the ministers, below the ministers, you also have lots of permanent secretaries here, and this is probably the highest rank every civil servant can achieve. And for the party, also the prime minister will be the leader of the party, and therefore decides the nominations of each district, and that's also a very important power. And another interesting thing about the parliamentary system, especially the executive-legislative relationship, is how prime ministers lose his or her power. So basically, first of all, I mean, as I said, institutionally, the parliaments have the power to vote, to cast a vote of no confidence or confidence. And this is a different kinds of vote from other types of, you have other regular votes, you just vote on bills, right? But so sometimes will be a special session. Now, if the legislature wanted to raise the vote of no confidence, then it means that this once this proposal got passed, then the parliament, so there are two decisions basically. First of all, the prime minister has to resign, but at the same time, the prime minister can what? Can dissolve the parliament, and then you have a new election coming up. So that's there are only two results. So depending on, of course, depending on the confidence of the prime minister, whether he or she thinks that they're going to win, the party is going to win the election. If they think there's a chance, then maybe they would just dissolve the parliament. Otherwise, they'll just choose a new one. And in terms of how prime minister loses his or her power, there's a very famous case actually, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher has been, was the prime minister for about like 11 years. So very, very long serving prime minister in British history. But her loss of power actually was pretty much an insult to herself, because there was a coup inside the Tory party. And lots of politicians inside her own party actually didn't agree with her on lots of policies. And therefore, well, as I said, I mean, essentially in the parliamentary system, you either have elections coming up anyway, so you have to have a new election. And once you have a new election, of course, you have a new party in power, right? So that's a very natural way for a prime minister to leave. Or you have some kind of coup inside the parliament, but it's actually quite rare for the coup inside the party, because that represents used to be the leader of the party, but now he or she loses the confidence or the trust from his or her peers. And so Margaret Thatcher, again, I mean, you can also check some of the documentaries online. It's pretty dramatic that she was kind of betrayed by her people she trusted for quite a while. And so this is a British system, and next we're going to talk about the German system. So we can compare actually, because both British and German systems are parliamentary systems, and therefore you can see the differences actually. But of course there's one important difference, which is UK is a unitary state and Germany is a federal state, and therefore there are some differences there, even though they are both bicameral. So in the German case, the number of seats now currently as of March 2024 is 735. So again, I mean, it's hard not to contrast that number with Taiwanese number. So we really have very small parliaments. But maybe we can talk about whether that's good or not. So there are 735 members of the parliament, or Bundestag. This is their lower chamber. Their term of office is 4 years. So compared to the British case, which is 5 years, so the tenure for the German legislators is a little bit shorter, and their powers. So for the Bundestag is a lower chamber again. So you can propose bills, and if a bill has to be jointly proposed by 5% of the party caucus, and they can also pass constitutional amendments, but you need 2/3 majority from both legislatures. So in other words, both Bundestag and Bundesrat, and then they can also do impeachment. All right, this is 3 powers of the Bundestag. But in the Bundestag, they have standing and ad hoc committees inside the chamber. What is interesting is that they have this council of elders, and this council of elders is composed of 28 members, and the important jobs for the council of elders, you can tell by the name, right? They are composed of the senior politicians. Okay, so senior politicians inside the Bundestag, and they can do the agenda setting. So as we just showed you for quite several times, this is important power to set the agenda, and then and they can also appoint committee chairman. So it's much more concentrated, I have to say. So we can keep making this contrast between different congresses. For example, So here in Taiwan, I mean, we just saw the news about how our legislatures they chose uh, the, the committee chairman and also the people who set the agenda, right? So the convener of each committee. So in Taiwan, it's basically elected by each committee itself. So it's not elected like this. This is chosen by senior members of the legislature. So using this council of elders, so it's very power is much more in that sense more concentrated in German system compared to the Taiwanese system. They can also appoint the committee chairman. And so this is Bundestag, so in their lower chamber, and they also have Bundesrat, which is the chamber representing, as I said, the interests of individual subunits of the state. So in German case, it's based on the population size of each Bund. So in other words, different Bunds, they have different sizes, they have different numbers of the members from 3 to 6, and it's much smaller actually. Only 69 members, and of course in the U.S. is 100 and 102. But the Bundesrat, the members, they don't have fixed terms, and the reason is, well, they're basically all representatives from each Bund. So it's from mostly they're officials of the state governments. So in that sense, of course, they represent the interests of each state or each Bund, but at the same time, they don't have independent elections for them. So they can be the people. They don't have fixed term. They might serve more than one term or 2 terms, depending on, of course, the state governments. And their powers, first, they can ratify treaties, and they can also, as I said, they can also they also have power of constitution amendments because you need 2/3 majority from both. And they can also propose bill. So in that sense, the powers, they're incongruent, but they're pretty symmetric. But one thing that is very special about Bundesrat, which is not the case in American Senate. Well, in the American Senate, you have 2 members from each state, but they basically vote independently, right? And sometimes they come from different parties. But here, in the German Bundesrat, the upper chamber, they have to vote. They have to vote as a block. So that's why they call it block vote. So what does that mean? It means that all the members from each Bund, they have to vote in the same direction, either yes or no. So that makes the calculation a bit easier because you don't have necessarily 69 independent votes. You actually have, depending on the number of Bundes in Germany. So you basically, all the people inside a particular block have to vote consistently. So this is different from, as I said, the American context. And then you have these 2 different chambers, and once they have conflicts, they will have this mediation committee choosing 16 members from each, and mediation committee is used for solve the conflicts between the 2. But another interesting feature about the German system is that, we just mentioned this in the British case, that the parliaments can cast vote of confidence, right? But in the German case, they call this constructive vote of no confidence. So in other words, okay, so this is interesting, right? Because if you vote, if the parliament passes the vote of no confidence, there are only 2 results, as I said. Either the prime minister resigns or the parliament is dissolved. But there's no condition for example, you have to choose the second prime minister. But of course, in the German case, they call it chancellor, not prime minister. So in the German case, if there's a proposal of a vote of no confidence, you need to include a nominee of the next chancellor. So if you cannot do that, then don't do that. So that's why it's constructive vote. You need to guarantee you have a successor. Otherwise, you cannot even propose this. So that's kind of raised the bar, right? So the examples in German history, of course, these are two examples. For example, like 1972, Rainer Basel was proposed to replace Willy Brandt, but it failed. And then in 1982, Helmut Kohl was proposed to replace another Helmut Schmidt, but it succeeded. So the thing is just, you know, if you, well, later, I mean, in your sophomore year, you're going to take comparative governments, and where you would have more details about the politics in each country. But in a German constitutional design, I think it's probably the legacy from the Second World War. There are lots of designs that were in lots of designs that used to stabilize the German politics. So, for example, like this constructive vote of no confidence, it's a way to avoid the political instability, probably based on the memories from the Weimar German, Weimar Republic. So this is an important feature, and make it less likely or more difficult to cast a vote of this. Okay, so let's take a break for 10 minutes and then come back for the others. All right, so let's come back for our final hours. So in almost all the parliamentary systems, there's a feature that we cannot ignore, which is we have to make a distinction between two different kinds of heads. One is the head of the state, and the other one is the head of the government. And the prime minister or chancellor or premier, these are, of course, the head of the governments. They are the actual leaders and the decisions, but making decisions. But at the same time, they will also be a head of the state. So in the British case, it would be the king or the queen, right? And in the German case, they have the president. And so it's just figurative. And the terms of office for this president will be 5 years. And again, this president, even though, I mean, this person is not royalty, but the thing is, the powers this person has is also very, very limited, because the real power resides in the prime minister or chancellor's hands. So that means this German president is almost like a German equivalent of the British monarch. So the role tends to be just ceremonial, and the elections, when the election happens, then it will be the chair of the federal convention. So this person doesn't actually have too much power, too much role to play in German politics. But the chancellor is very powerful, right? Because the chancellor, he or she, is the head of the government, not the head of the state. Remember, that's the distinction. Almost all the parliamentary systems make. And then German chancellor can also propose bill, and also in terms of the cabinet members, he can appoint members he or she likes. And another thing that is kind of special about the German system is that, well, yeah, I think I was quite surprised to learn this. So except for the ministries of defense, judiciary, and finance, the German chancellor can actually determine the number of government departments. So it's not like here, for example. I mean, you have fixed number of government departments. If you want to, create a new one or demolish some other ones, then you have to pass some laws. But in the German case, it seems that they can also decide how many or what kind of departments they want to have. So it's a bit more flexible than other systems. And okay, so that's a German case that we went through the Bundestag, Bundesrat, and also some executive powers. And then next is the US case. So the US case, now it's a very different system, right? It's no longer the parliamentary system, now the presidential one. So that's why we actually also choose France, because the French system is a semi-presidential one. So you will see the difference among all these three different types. So in the US, again, it's bicameral. We have mentioned this for several times. And the House of Representatives has 435 members. Again, well, of course, US is huge, but still. But in that sense, I mean, the US is larger than Germany, but the number of members is actually smaller. And in the Senate, you have 100 members, so 2 from each of the state. Okay, so it's bicameral, and so let's get into a little bit of details. So the U.S. legislative process, members from either legislature can propose. Okay, so they're very symmetric, but the thing is, revenue-related bills, and this is almost, I guess, the case in many bicameral systems. The power regarding revenues normally would belong to the lower chambers. So in other words, in American context, revenue-related bills need to be proposed at the House of Representatives, and the Senate can only make revisions. So this is, well, if you want to say there are some asymmetries, this is one of them. One of the symmetries between the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the resolutions, they can also pass resolutions, but there are different kinds. First kind is the simple resolutions. This can be passed at either one, and you don't need presidential signature. And so for simple resolutions, there's no legal power. We can actually check a little bit, when you see any like resolutions from the United States Congress, which kind of resolutions it is. And second is concurrent resolutions. So for this kind of resolutions, they have to be passed at both. And again, but there's no need for presidential signature. And again, so there's no legal power either. But the most important one actually is this, the joint resolutions, more important than simple and concurrent ones. So for joint resolutions, they have to be passed at both, but at this moment, presidential signature is needed and therefore with legal power of this kind of resolution. And also beyond other normal kinds of resolutions, so when it comes to constitutional amendments, you need 2/3 majority for both. But at this time, you don't need presidential signature. So that's the constitutional amendments. So for debates, there are also some differences between the two chambers. So for the House of Representatives, there's a committee of the whole. You need 218 members to attend this. And the rules is this. Well, it could be either restrictive, so in other words, only limited to certain regions. It could be closed, so you have limited debate time, or it could be open, so all kinds of revisions are allowed. So in terms of voting, so that's why if you ever had a chance to see the broadcast of the ongoing procedures inside the Congress, you see that. So for example, when you vote, there are 3 different kinds of way to vote. First one is voice vote. So people just shout yay or nay, right? So then and then the speaker probably decide the volume of the voice to decide which side wins. It is yay or nay. And then also, okay, standing vote, you stand up to show your approval or disapproval. And then also, I guess you can do this by speakers. So you can also have the roll call vote. So basically they will just call you one by one to see to know what you're thinking about. And the Senate, in the Senate, there are no procedural limitations. But the thing is, in the Senate, sometimes they do this filibuster. So in other words, they talk and talk for a long time in order to block undesirable bills. But what to do about this? Because this is obviously going to procrastinate the bill for can be forever actually. So there's a closure rule. It's a bit like the closure we talk about in the British case, guillotine, but it's different. So you need 3/5 approval of the senators to end filibuster. So you can end it, but the thing is you need to get 3/5 number of votes. And inside the Senate, you have voice vote or a roll call vote. So there's no standing vote. So this is the process inside the both chambers. When it comes to again, so if there are some conflicts that happen between the two chambers, they will convene a conference committee. But the thing is, the conference committee's resolutions can only be voted on and cannot be revised. So it's a little bit like what we just talked about. You just have to take it or leave it once they finish the revisions. And the president's role, as I said, is the checks and balances. And therefore, for anything that got passed in the Congress, the president has the power to veto those bills. But at the same time, the Congress can also override the veto with 2/3 majorities. So that's why I said, I mean, in the US, it's not just about the three components, right? It's also about how these different institutions, they can check and balance each other. So this is a way executive and legislatures, they check and balance, against each other. So this is, well, I mean, I guess all these details, as I said, I mean, we won't talk about too many of those details, but just to give you a rough sense of how, all these legislatures work. And next is the French system. For the French system, it's also quite unique in the sense that it's also bicameral, right? So even though I think the upper chamber of the French doesn't actually catch that much attention, but it's a bicameral system. So they have a Senate and then the lower chamber is a National Assembly. In the National Assembly, they have 577 members, also quite large, I have to say. In the elections, but in the French system, I mean, this is actually quite a hot topic nowadays, right? So because some KMT legislators are proposing amendments for our current system, either to change it from 1-round to 2-round system in the election, or there are other revisions. But let's take a look at the French case. So elections, there are 577 small districts, and then it's a 2 rounds majority voting. So in other words, if none of the candidates get the 50% majority in the first round, then they'll get to the second round. Well, I have to say it's a way to create majorities, right? Because the first rounds, especially in the French system, there are quite a few different parties, and therefore there are many candidates, and so it's very likely that they each, of course, they draw, their constituents to vote for them, and therefore none of them get more than 50% of the votes in a district. That's very common. But then in the second rounds, they can pick the first two leading candidates and then have a deuce. And so in that case, voters will have to be forced to vote for one of the candidates, and therefore you can manufacture 50% majority in this way. In terms of office, so it's at most 5 years. Powers in National Assembly includes budget deliberation, constitutional amendment proposals for referendum, and also vote of no confidence. This is the National Assembly. And for the Senate, it has 348 members. And then the terms of office would be 6 years. And the powers is asymmetric. It's symmetric. It's supposed to be symmetric. It's the same as the National Assembly, but without the vote of no confidence. But that's quite substantial. And the thing is, I think when it comes to the French system, it's always people want to mention the experiences of cohabitation. And there's a question that was asked recently here that why, I mean, the Taiwanese system, at least in academic literature, is oftentimes defined as a semi-presidential system. So that means that we have a very similar system with the French system. But there are some key differences. I think you might remember, because our prime minister doesn't need to be approved. So the nomination doesn't have to be approved by the Congress. But in the French case, they have to do that. So the thing is, as I said, we now do have a case of divided governments. So the president doesn't own the majority of the Congress. And in the French experience, indeed, when they have the cohabitation, that means that the president belongs to one party and the prime minister might actually belong to the other party. So they have to cohabit. So to cohabitate, they have to live together in a sense. So a lot of people here in Taiwan are also thinking about that. So looking at the French case and think, oh, why we don't have this here? In back to 2000, that was when DPP candidate Chen Shui-bian, won the presidential election, but then he didn't have the majority in the Congress. So when that happens, of course, people raise the question, whether Chen Shui-bian should actually appoint someone from KMT, but he did, not from KMT. He appointed someone as independent, even though that person was formerly a KMT member, but then he didn't represent KMT when he joined the government. So he was appointed as independent. So it means that KMT didn't want to play the game with Chen Shui-bian. And now we have this very similar case again. But before we maybe talk about this interesting issue happening now in Taiwan, we should maybe just look at there are three until now there are three cases, but let's talk about the first two. So the cohabitation, especially here in Taiwan, it has caught a lot of attention previously. And so people try to understand, once you have a cohabitation, then how do you do this division of labor between the president and the prime minister? So, but first of all, for the president, there's something what they call the reserved domain. So in other words, this is the jurisdictions of the presidents, and president has a power over them. So some of the powers, they are solo powers. So first of all, the power to nominate prime minister, even though during the cohabitation, the president was forced to nominate someone from the other party. And then another power is the referendum. That's the solo power. And then third, to dissolve the National Assembly. And fourth, to announce national emergency. So these are the powers only belong to the president. So even though the president, appointed someone from different parties to be the prime minister, that doesn't mean the prime minister can have all these powers. These are powers of the presidents for sure. So, of course, again, as I said, you get more about these in your sophomore years. But so the first cohabitation happened for about 2 years from 1986 to 1988. And during that time, you have two players, basically. One is the president back then. The left is the president, Francis Mitterrand. And then the prime minister, the rightist, Jacques Chirac. So these two, they come from different parties, different ideologies. But it so happens that the president back then was Mitterrand from the left. But then he lost the majority from the National Assembly. And therefore, he had to appoint another person. But that was, at least from the studies afterwards, the first cohabitation, well, it's pretty feisty, I have to say. It's very contentious because that's the first time they had experience about this. And then therefore, somehow, Mitterrand, previously they enjoyed the majority in the National Assembly, and therefore, it's like the president under presidential system, right? So it's like Donald Trump or Joe Biden now enjoy the full amount of power given by the system. But all of a sudden, when they lost the election of the National Assembly, and then forced to appoint someone, but logic is very clear, right? Here in Taiwan, the president doesn't have to seek approval from the Congress. So institutionally, even though politically it could be unpopular, but institutionally, any, the nominee doesn't need to have the approval from the Congress anyway. But in a French case, that's not the case. If president always nominated someone unacceptable by the National Assembly, that means that you never would have a prime minister. And therefore, I think that's a key difference. Here is viable for the president to work this without the approval of the Congress, and therefore we can, of course, as I said, sometimes it could be unpopular, right? The prime minister can, encounter a lot of troubles in the Congress, but constitutionally, that's not a requirement. But in the French case, that's a requirement, and therefore, you need to, I guess, the Mitterrand had to, make a concession anyway, so he had to give in. And so he was, I think, forced to appoint Jacques Chirac. And what happened during that time was, of course, these are extremely just very, very brief. So one conflict is that back then it was this G7 summit, and then both president and prime minister attended the summit, and then but who represented France? Right, so that's, I guess, a lot of national leaders would ask. And also Mitterrand also refused to sign certain bills. So in other words, I think in the first cohabitation, I suppose, the whole system was still learning how to manage this. So then came the second one. The second cohabitation happened between 1993 and 1995. And this time, still the president was the leftist, Francis Mitterrand, and then the prime minister is still from the right, but this time it's not Chirac, but Balladur. According to, of course, compared to the first one, it seems that it's a consensual cohabitation. So Mitterrand obviously during that period kind of gave up to fight, but the most important thing is the rightist majority in the National Assembly was more consolidated. And therefore, I guess it doesn't mean much for Mitterrand. Didn't have much space to play. So, but the thing is, the lessons, especially a lot of scholars, constitutional scholars here and political scientists here, learned from these two cases is that in a semi-presidential system, it's not a presidential system, so the power doesn't always reside in the hands of the presidents. And it's not a parliamentary system, so the prime minister sometimes would simply be the chief of the staff for the president. When the president and the prime minister, they come from the same party, the system will, so it's like, I know this is a little bit controversial, but some people are arguing that. So there are two tracks. This is our former professor here who died last year. This is actually his, he wrote some papers on this. So he said there are two tracks in a French system. One is the presidential one. The other one is the parliamentary one. So when the president and the prime minister belong to the same party, so the French system would behave like a presidential system. But once the president loses the majority in the National Assembly, and the power, even though, as we just said, there are some solo powers belonging to the president, but most of the powers, especially when it comes to actual policy making, the power will be shifted to the prime minister, and therefore the French system now moves to the other track, which is the parliamentary system. So in other words, the French system kind of like fluctuates between these two different tracks, depending on who owns the majority in the National Assembly. So you see that the point is the pivot. What's a pivot? The pivot here is depending on whether you can enjoy the majority in the Congress.
English?
If you can,
No.
okay, all right. So someone is talking.
Which means that.
Is someone talking here? Are you asking questions or sorry?
What? Yes.
Anyone asking question here?
Yes. Okay, perfect. Appreciate it.
So let me mute them.
Right.
Okay, let me know if you have any questions here. So people from the online session. Anyway, so that's the conclusion from the papers. So from our former colleague. So there are two tracks. It's a two-track system, and you can switch, and depending on who owns the majority in a national assembly. Okay, so that's interesting, right? But if Taiwan Taiwan's system is also defined as a semi-presidential system, but switching tracks never happens here. Never. So that's in sometimes that means that we have a few cases of minority governments until now, right? So when Chen Shui-bian first elected as a president, almost actually over all the 8 years under him, it was a minority government, and then came Ma Ying-jeou, right? And Ma Ying-jeou, the 8 years under Ma Ying-jeou, of course, that's not the case because KMT enjoyed the majority for the entire 8 years, and then for Tsai Ing-wen, right? Tsai Ing-wen, of course, Tsai Ing-wen also enjoyed a majority in both terms, but now came William Lai. So Lai Ching-te obviously now he hasn't been inaugurated, but obviously DPP has lost the majority in the Congress. And therefore, that's almost like a repetition of the Chen Shui-bian era. But what's going to happen, we'll see. Okay, so I guess I read pretty quickly just through some institutional settings for all these 4 countries, United Kingdom, Germany, United States, and France. Well, just to give you a sense, like we started from, again, last week, a more abstract way to analyze institutions. And then what I want to say is that, all these countries, well, we try to simplify some details to make it like this is the system of this and that. But in the end, when you do the actual analysis, policymaking analysis, you do have to take into account some of these details. And then change the model and the parameters of the model to make it work in each of these contexts. So we have a little time, I think, today, because I always want to have more interactive sessions, and therefore we can have some discussion questions and then see if you have any views on all these questions and have a discussion. So let me read the first one. So according to the veto player theory, so given a very similar ideological setup in the country's partisan structure, will the bicameralism in legislature make this country more or less likely to implement reform compared to unicameralism? So this is like not too difficult, I suppose. So anyone wants to try? Just answer this question for us. Yep. So it's less likely to implement. But we said if they have a very similar ideological setup. So last time we did mention this, right? So there are 2 parameters. One is the number of veto players, and the other one is the distance, ideological distance. So increasing the number of veto players doesn't always shrink the win set. So, right, so in this case, because of this condition of very similar ideological setup, so maybe it's easier, or not easier, I should say, but it might not make it less easy or more difficult to happen. So, well, I mean, this is probably pretty straightforward, but what I want to emphasize is that, well, you have all these parameters, so you do have to pay attention to them. Wait a minute. Okay, and then the next one. So this is a question that I think was raised for a couple of times. So in your opinion, is a decline of legislature good or bad to be a democracy? To a democracy, why? And let me also explain the context a little bit. So recently, I think the discussion is, of course, legislature is always supposedly the center of the democracy, right? So from the historical, background, uh, exactly the king or the king or queen, they include the aristocrats in the legislature in order to get more resources when they want to do something like to fight in a war, right? So and then gradually, when especially in the Western history, gradually the franchise or was extended to people, uh, all the adults in the country. Then that's when we have a democracy, right? So now the franchise is not just enjoyed by those people who have money or who are aristocrats. So legislature is always the center of democracy. It's also viewed as the center for the expansion of democracy. But recently, I think the reason is the modern technologies have made it more difficult to make policies. So in terms of the knowledge and the capacity to prepare for, writing a bill, legislative legislative members or congressmen, congresswomen, it's become less likely for them to do this. And also, it's also more difficult for them to monitor everything the government is doing because of the technological barriers. And the reason, again, another reason is a lot of the members of the Congress, they are not necessarily experts, but the people who work for the governments, they tend to be experts, right? Because they have to, for example, you have to pass certain civil service exams, and they can hire experts, and they are more resourceful. So there is actually a discussion for quite a while that since in modern times, the legislature and its function is kind of declining, given this. So that's why the question: do you think it's the decline of this, whether it's good or bad to democracy, and why? And sometimes, well, I mean, another thing is, even though I tend to sidestep from political landmines, the problem is sometimes if you look at our legislatures, you start wondering, what are they doing? So what are they asking, right? So do they know anything they're asking? So that's the problem here. Uh, some we run surveys across different countries quite often, and when we ask people their impressions about their own Congress or their own legislatures, people's perceptions of their Congresses tend to be very low. And I don't know if you have any personal tastes. So when you look at either our own legislators or politicians from other countries, do you think they're doing good jobs? So this is an open-ended question. I don't. There's no standard answer, but just I guess out of the interest of knowing your views on this. Anyone want to say something? No? Well, the center of this issue is that, well, legislators, they're elected because they're popular, right? So sometimes you have people who are not necessarily qualified, but because they're popular, they get elected. All right. And compared to that, of course, inside the government, there might be more rigorous procedures with picking people, with choosing people to be bureaucrats. So sometimes, I'm not always the case, but sometimes maybe bureaucrats or people working for the governments tend to be more professional. So there's a gap between them. So I guess the question here, or the concern is, even though ideally, democracy is the system where we respect the voices from all leaders in a society.
right? All backgrounds in a society, whether you are well educated or you're not well educated, you deserve a voice in a Congress. And therefore, when ordinary people vote, they might vote for someone who is not necessarily qualified. That's, could be the case, right? So that's why this question arises, because modern legislatures might not necessarily do a very good job in terms of monitoring what the executives is doing, because they simply cannot do that. But that would be a serious issue for democracy, because democracy counts on their performance to be functioning. And therefore, the decline might not be the good thing. And also, on the other hand, but sometimes it's because the legislature might not have enough capacity to do that. But sometimes it's also because this is bad. Also because executive they don't want to be held accountable for the mistakes they make. And therefore, if the legislature is not powerful enough, they might not be able to identify those mistakes, and therefore allow incapable governments to continue to be in power. So that's also bad. So in other words, I mean, this question, I don't know, maybe it's too vague. But what I want to say is that there are reasons that we should worry about the quality of the legislatures, but also reasons to worry about this decline might actually hurt the democracy and accountability that we view dear. Okay, so I don't know, but this is the question. But the final one, this is actually also quite interesting. The committee system, as we just went through all the details in each country, all the countries in their legislatures, they have committees. So which means that, again, for the same reason that, the technological advances now are, so vast, and therefore legislatures also have to divide labors among themselves. So the committee system is present in most legislatures. So it might promote professionalism, but might also cause concerns about transparency. So can you think of ways to strike a fine balance between the two, between professionalism and transparency? If you have a division of labors among legislators themselves, and then they work in each committee, and of course, some people, especially, in Taiwan's case, for example, some legislators, they spend a lot of time. So, for example, they get elected for for a decade or 2 decades, and they continue to work in the same committee. So over time, indeed, they can obviously promote their professionalism, right? Knowing a lot of things in the field. But at the same time, with committee, the problem is people or legislators outside the committee might not be able to know what's happening inside the committee, right? And therefore, it's become less transparent. So in that sense, there's some kind of trade-off between the two. Professionalism versus transparency. So, that's another worry. And so the question is, can you think of ways to strike a fine balance between the two? On the one hand, you want to promote professionalism, but on the other hand, we also want the system to be very transparent to everyone, to every member in the Congress or to everyone in the society. So again, so any thoughts on this? Yeah.
Organization. Like the citizen complaints watch, so that people can know.
In the broadcast. What did you say? You say.
Is that the organization?
Mhm.
They can just let people know that what happened in the what they are.
Oh, right. So they have to disclose a lot of things that happened inside the committee. So that's for sure. That's for sure. Right. So the suggestion is they should just publish or live stream what's happening inside the committee. Well, that's what we do now, actually. So it's if you have time, I would encourage you to watch those live streaming of all the committees here in Taiwanese legislature, because that's pretty well, it's pretty not just interesting but pretty funny to watch. And the reason is sometimes our bureaucrats might not necessarily be good speakers, and therefore it's a way to know, where the money went, but you are not the taxpayers, but I would care. So we pay taxes, and then how they spend our money. Okay, so right, so these are all open-ended questions, and if you don't have further thoughts, I think I also want to ask if you have any questions regarding the materials, the analysis, and anything you don't understand, you want to ask. But it's normally the case that when I ask this in public and in front of the class, I mean, I don't get any questions. But then later, you got emails and visits. So yeah, right, I understand that, but it just I would also encourage you to speak in public more. So that would save us a lot of time, and also just practice your public speech. That would be nice. So no questions? Yeah, please go ahead. Well, why professionalism sometimes can go against transparency is you know what? For example, well, let me start from this. So we are all in different professions, and in a profession, we sometimes, well, probably because of convenience, we create shortcuts like jargons. So we talk about concepts only that we create concepts that only people inside the profession know. So professionalism is good because it means that you have lots of people who know this stuff much better than other people. And so so for these people, when they communicate with each other, they tend to create certain concepts or shortcuts for each other, so they don't have to spend time explaining everything in front of each other. So over time, so for example, you take, suppose you take classes from all these different departments, right? Economics, political science, and sociology. And in each discipline, they all have their own professional terms. And people outside these professions might not be able to understand. Well, this is especially the case, for example, I guess in econ, they create a separate language, right? So that's why when I talk about some things, and it's not, if you haven't taken any classes in that, you don't have any background knowledge, it's hard for you to understand, right? So well, professionalism is good. That means that as the society grows, you need division of labors among people, and so allow some people to focus more time, spend more time focusing on something, so they become experts, right? So if you apply that logic and reasoning to this, so in a legislature, supposedly each member should have equal access to everything, right? But if you divided the legislature further into different committees and allow people to focus on just one particular area, over time, I suppose, you have certain things that the people outside this, the committee might not be able to know. And that's why you create I mean, the thing is, of course, institutionally, I suppose in each committee, you have members, and only these members can vote for bills and inside this committee. So others, they can sit in, just listen. That's fine. But the thing is, the threat to transparency is that once these committees create certain things that only they themselves understand, then that would make other people difficult to understand. And that's the concern. That's the tension between the two. But there might not be good solutions. Well, eventually, all the bills have to go to the plenary session, so everyone attends, right? So that's the third, so you want to go to the third reading, you have to do that. But the thing is, when you are at that stage, except for those people who are in a committee, they don't know what's going on. They just vote. And sometimes that could be just very unconscious. Just you just vote and vote along the party lines. But the details have been discussed previously, and you don't get the chance to. So I guess that the problem here is that this is inevitable, given the complexity of all these modern affairs. It's inevitable that you have to divide, labors among themselves. Otherwise, well, I mean, in Taiwan, there are 113 members in the Congress, but, as we just went through, in other countries, they have 700, 600, 400. So how could you have a nice discussion among 700 people, right? We have what? About 100 then. I suppose it's also difficult to talk to everyone. So imagine that you have 400 people in a room. So it's almost inevitable, but the thing is, the concern is still there. Well, so thank you. I mean, so for today, I think we finished the institutional analysis and also legislature. And for next week, we're coming to think bureaucracy, executive powers. So I'll see you next week.